Hello, and welcome to our Real Estate Withholding training class on Form 593 Real Estate Withholding Statement. I'm Sonia Karamazza.
And I'm Chelsea Bryant.
Agenda. Today we will review Form 593 Real Estate Withholding Statement, FTB 4064 Quick Reference Guide, California Real Estate Withholding Brochure, Common Errors, and lastly, Remitter Responsibilities. Real Estate Withholding Statement, Form 593. Generally, withholding is required on the sale or transfer of California real property unless an exemption applies. Remitters should remind the sellers that when withholding is required, they are not being double taxed. The tax is withheld up front, similar to wage withholding from an employer. Today, we will break down the 7 parts of Form 593 and explain who is responsible for completing each part. Part 1. Remitter Information. Here we have the top of Side 1 of Form 593. Part 1 should be completed by the remitter, also known as the withholding agent or escrow agent. The amended box should only be checked by the remitter if a Form 593 has already been submitted and processed by FTB, and the remitter is submitting a second Form 593 to make a correction. Be sure to enter the escrow or exchange number on the top right corner of the form. Remitter information. This is the part where the remitter type is selected. Please check REAP, Qualified Intermediary, Buyer Transferee, or Other. The business name or first and last name should be entered, as well as the appropriate tax ID. Please note that if the remitter is an escrow agent, we do not need their name. When the transaction is an installment sale, the remitter is the buyer, and we need their name in that instance. Next, the full address is required. And lastly, enter the telephone number, which will allow us to call the remitter if we have questions regarding Form 593. Part 2. Seller Transfer Information. This part should be completed by the seller or their tax professional. Their grantor non-grantor trust box should be checked accordingly, but only if it applies and only if the trust is on title. The seller's name and social security number is required. If the seller is a grantor trust, also known as living trust, then the name of the grantor and their social security number should be included. This is because they will be the ones reporting the sale and income on their California income tax return. If the property is jointly owned, enter the spouse info. If a business is on title or if a non-grantor trust is on title, the name of said business or trust should be included as well as their tax ID. The individual's name and trust name should never both be included. It must be one or the other. Next, we need the address and phone number of the seller as well as the property address that is being sold. The last field in Part 2 needed is ownership percentage. If the owners of the property are spouses and they are the only ones on title, 100% should be shown. If several siblings or partners own a property, a separate Form 593 must be completed for each owner, and they must include their correct ownership percentage of the property. Part 3. Certifications which fully exempt the sale from withholding. This part is completed by the seller. The seller must review and check all boxes that apply to them. As stated on the bottom of Part 3, if the seller checked any boxes, they do not need to complete any other parts of the form. They do, however, need to go to Side 3 and review and complete the perjury statement. We will review the perjury statement later on in this presentation. Part 4. Certifications that may partially or fully exempt the sale from withholding or if no withholding applies. This part is completed by the seller. The seller must review and check all boxes that apply to them. Box 12 must be checked if no exemptions in Part 3 or 4 applies. This means withholding is required on the sale. Part 5. Buyer Transferee Information. Part 5 is located on the top of Side 2 of Form 593. The remitter name, tax ID, and escrow exchange number should be completed by the remitter. Part 5 must be completed by the buyer, but only if the transaction is an installment sale. The buyer's name, tax ID, address, and phone number must be included. The principal amount of promissory note, installment amount, interest rate, and month of the repayment period must also be included. A copy of the signed promissory note must also be submitted by the remitter when the first installment payment is made. Subsequent withholding payments made by the remitter will not need to include the promissory note or signatures from the seller. Please note the buyer is responsible for submitting all withholding payments. Buyer's transferee acknowledgement to withhold. In an installment sale, the buyer must read this section and agree to the following: withhold on the principal portion of each installment payment, complete Form 593 and 593V, and submit it to the Franchise Tax Board along with the withholding payment by the due date. Provide a copy of the 593 to the seller. If terms of the promissory note or payment schedule change, the buyer must inform Franchise Tax Board as soon as possible. The buyer may be subject to penalties for late filing of forms or payments and or not providing copies to the seller by the due date. Lastly, the buyer must sign the perjury statement on side 3. Part 6. Computation. This part should only be completed by the seller if they checked box 3 in Part 3, which is certifying they have a loss on the sale, or to determine their gain on the sale if they would like to elect the alternative withholding calculation. The remitter must ensure this part is completed if the seller is claiming a loss. If it's not completed, the remitter must withhold the standard 3 1/3% of the total sales price and submit to the Franchise Tax Board. This is a continuation of the computation from side 2. The remitter name and tax ID must be included on the top of side 3. Although the remitter is not required to review the computation, they are required to ensure the computation is completed. Part 7. Escrow or exchange information. Part 7 must be completed in its entirety by the remitter. Please note line 34 only applies to cash poor exchanges and should not be completed otherwise. Line 37, amount withheld from seller, is often left blank. Leaving any lines blank may result in processing delays and may result in potential penalty assessments on the remitter. Perjury statement. The seller is required to check the applicable boxes and certify all the information provided is correct by signing the form. A seller's signature is always required. The buyer's signature is only required in an installment sale. Please remember the seller's signature is only required on the first withholding payment in an installment sale. Subsequent payments only require the signature of the buyer, who is then responsible for submitting withholding payments and Form 593. The remitter's signature is not required. However, their name and business name and phone number is required. I will now hand off the remainder of the presentation to Chelsea.
Thank you, Sonia. Now we will review the Quick Reference Guide California Real Estate Withholding 4064 brochure. This brochure is a guide to help you complete Form 593. It is available by request on www.ftb.ca.gov. Enter 4064 in the search box and follow the prompts. This is the front cover of the 4064 brochure. It includes our contact information and a brief overview of the brochure's contents. The brochure breaks down the 5 real estate transaction types: traditional sale with full exemption from withholding, partial exemption from withholding, no exemption from withholding, installment sales, and also like-kind exchanges, and the responsibilities for remitter, seller, and buyer. Please be sure to obtain your copy on our website and refer to it as needed. Now we will go over the most common errors on the FTB Form 593. A common error that we are seeing is the amended box is being checked incorrectly. The amended box should only be checked if the remitter is making a correction to the initial 593 that was submitted to FTB. Another error is several boxes are checked that are contradictory. For example, box 1 in part 3 is selected to verify the property being sold is the seller's principal residence, and then box 12 in part 4 is selected to certify that no exemptions apply. Let's look at a few more issues we're seeing. Incomplete forms are being submitted. Part 7 should be completed by the remitter. We are seeing this part being skipped entirely. We are also seeing line 37, amount withheld by seller, being left blank. This will delay the processing of the Form 593. Please review the form to ensure everything is complete and accurate before you submit to FTB. Another issue is the perjury statement is incomplete and missing signatures. Regardless if the seller meets an exemption or partial exemption in parts 3 or 4, the seller's signature is required and the perjury statement must be completed. The seller and buyer need to check all applicable boxes in the perjury statement. The buyer's signature is only required for an installment sale transaction, and the remitter's contact information should be included on the last line of the form in case we need to contact them. Lastly, the seller's signature is required on every Form 593 submitted. A buyer's signature is only required if the transaction is an installment sale. Now we will go over your responsibilities as a remitter. Your 4 main responsibilities are withholding notification, FTB Form 593 verification, withhold and remit withholding, and retaining withholding forms. Your first responsibility is withholding notification. You are required to provide the buyer with written notification of their withholding requirements, and you must provide seller the copy of Form 593 to complete. Your second responsibility is to validate withholding exemptions. Verify certifications in Part 3 of Form 593 are accurate. For example, if you know the seller is selling a rental property or vacation home and they are claiming it was their principal residence, you should withhold. You must also verify the form is complete, signed, and received prior to the close of escrow. Lastly, if you have knowledge that the Form 593 is incorrect, do not accept the form. Your third responsibility is to withhold and remit withholding. Withhold the required amount from the seller and remit the withholding. You will need to submit a Form 593 and 593V and determine the amount of withholding to send over to FTB. To use the total sales price method, calculate the withholding at 3 1/3% of the total sales price. To use the alternative method, the seller will complete Part 6 computation and provide you with a completed Form 593. The withholding payment, Form 593 and Form 593V, are due the 20th day following the month of close of escrow. For example, if the closing date is March 1st or March 28th, both are due April 20th. Your fourth responsibility is to retain withholding forms. The remitter is required to retain copies of the Form 593 for 5 years following the closing date of the transaction. The Form 593 must be made available to FTB upon request. Contact information. We can be reached by phone at 916-845-4900 or 888-792-4900. Our website is www.ftb.ca.gov. To stay current on real estate withholding information, you can sign up for subscription services. Go to ftb.ca.gov and search subscription services and follow the prompts. Thank you for joining us.